Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Camilla Tominey, Associate Editor of The Telegraph, and I'm proud to introduce this panel on seizing Brexit opportunities. Brexit being back in the headlines thanks to the axis that is Starmer, Streeting and Burnham. And I'm joined by Daniel Hannan, who we will describe as an expert on the ideological, constitutional and global freedom aspects of Brexit. Liam Halligan, who we will describe as an expert on the harsh macroeconomics, inflation and productivity aspects of Brexit, and Catherine McBride, who will describe as an expert on the granular detail of international trade, tariffs and agriculture. Welcome, everyone. I was intrigued to read a recent survey about whether people had regrets. Regrets, we've had a few, and the conclusion from many of those polled was that they didn't regret Brexit itself, but just successive governments' inability to implement the benefits of it. So, do we think that the failure to realise a booming Brexit dividend has been a failure of the Brexit concept itself, or a profound failure of political execution? Liam?
Actually, this isn't a cop-out. I actually think it's too early to tell, in the sense that we didn't Brexit, really, until, 2020, January 31st, 2020, that was the beginning of the transition period. Then, of course, we were hit by lockdown, which sent macroeconomics, the world, across the world, into some kind of tailspin. And since then, the global economy seems to have lurched from crisis to crisis. But I think what's absolutely clear is that a lot of the scare stories turned out to be complete nonsense. Who remembers that Orwellian paid for by us 239-page report produced by the Treasury in April 2016 on a loop across the BBC and Sky for days and days and days, forward by George Osborne, saying that just the vote to Brexit would produce an immediate and profound economic shock. That didn't happen at all. After the Brexit vote, for the next 2 quarters, the economy actually accelerated. It reminds me of the great Anna Soubry's prediction on Question Time that exports to the EU, if we leave the European Union, would go almost absolutely to zero, whatever that means. And of course, what we have actually seen, we've seen a slight recalibration of trade since Brexit, to the extent that Brexit has been implemented, and it hasn't been implemented to all that degree, as I'm sure we'll come on to, though we have left the single market and the customs union. Broadly speaking, in nominal terms, our exports across the world have increased quite heartily. There's been a recalibration away from goods trade and towards services trade, because of course we're trading more with the rest of the world. And in terms of growth, we've been pretty much in the middle of the G7 pack since Brexit in terms of headline GDP growth. We've outgrown the Germans and the French. They were still in the EU last time I checked. And the EU countries that have actually outpaced us, I think that America is separate, have been largely exhibiting catch-up growth, having been embroiled in the Eurozone crisis of the early 2010s. Of course, remember, the same people that told us that the Brexit would be a disaster told us for 20 years that no country could ever leave the Eurozone. That was completely disproved. So I think a lot of the scare stories have been disproved, and a lot of the predictions about the future are counterfactuals, often put forward by interest groups in the public sector and the private sector, who have never actually got over the fact that in the biggest democratic vote in British history, people voted to leave.
Thank you. Catherine, we'll come to you in a second, Daniel, but Catherine, Liam there mentioning, I think, exports up 23%, and yet there's a public perception that the opportunities of Brexit absolutely haven't been maximised.
Yeah, I think that the biggest problem we've had is actually in the media, because apart from the Telegraph, and you and Liam have, and GB News, most of the media has convinced the public that our GDP is 4% lower. Now, when no one believed that, they increased it to 8% lower. People keep saying that we've stopped trading with people, but none of that is true. What has happened is we've now got really accurate trade data. And this is thanks to HMRC. As most of you will know, if you want something counted properly, put taxes on it and ask the HMRC to count it for you, and they'll get it absolutely spot on. Where before, our trade details were all counted by Intrastat, which was a survey. And because, as most people will tell you, there was no paperwork, which is not true actually, but less paperwork between borders, that often they didn't really know where trade was going. So we had this thing called the Rotterdam effect. So a lot of things that we said we were buying from EU countries, such as the Netherlands and Belgium, were actually coming from Costa Rica. You know, pineapple juice we used to record as coming from Belgium, when now we know it comes from Costa Rica and it goes to Belgium and then comes to us. So it's a lot of it is just more accurate figures. And people are refusing to admit that our trade before Brexit was inflated by Intrastat, who has an interest in trying to convince the world that the EU trades a lot more than it does. You know, and they count intra-EU trade. And we've also discovered that things we thought we were exporting to France were actually going into Luxembourg. Switzerland suddenly become a big market, which we probably thought those goods got as far as France and we didn't know where they went, you know. Well, they went to Switzerland, we now know that. You know, and so we get more accurate figures, but still this repeated lie in the media is that our GDP is 4% lower. Then what? Well, when you look into that, that is a made-up thing called a doppelganger. And someone has plucked half a dozen countries, and I imagine they sat there and selected the ones till they got the result they wanted. Because included in the doppelganger that is most often referred to, they include the United States. Now, the United States is the world's largest oil and gas exporter. It has been phenomenally good economic growth, not just through its oil exports, but also because it's had huge fiscal stimulus since the COVID thing, where Joe Biden pumped a lot of money into trying to bring companies back into the US. So it has been growing at a much faster rate than the rest of the world. Yet the doppelganger, which is meant to show us that the UK would be better off if we'd stayed in Europe, in the EU, is a doppelganger full of countries that are not in the EU. The most obvious one is the US, but you'll also find Australia and New Zealand are in this doppelganger, even though they're also not in the EU. And yet the public buy this simple fact because it keeps getting told to them. We're 4% lower. And no one looks at it and goes, well, how did you calculate that?
Sure. But then, Daniel, maybe Boris Johnson was very good at delivering Brexit, but not maximising it. And maybe he got kiboshed by COVID. And maybe subsequent Tory prime ministers weren't invested in it enough, because if they had made more of the opportunities, we wouldn't perhaps now be in a situation where the public is warming to Streeting / Burnham rhetoric on reversing the referendum.
Kiboshed by COVID, kiboshed by a civil service that refused to implement the direct instructions they were getting, but above all, kiboshed by Parliament. The thing that I think is bewilderingly absent from this debate is the vote in Parliament to have legislative effect to the effect that we would not be allowed to leave other than on terms that Brussels liked. Right? They didn't use exactly that phrase. What they said was, we will not allow a no-deal Brexit. But if you think about it for 30 seconds, that's the same, isn't it? Right? Yeah. It's going into a negotiation saying, I need you to understand before we start talking that I will not get up from this table until you are happy with the deal. What do you expect the other party to do in that situation? That was what happened after the 2017 election. And it is quite extraordinary that the people who passed that legislation and voted for it then have the gall to turn around and say, well, this isn't going as well as you thought. I mean, it's like, and that people are letting them get away with it. So look, I mean, who remembers the morning of the 24th of June 2016?
Very
right?
clear.
Yeah, it was a beautiful morning, wasn't it? Do you remember the day before had been raining heavily, the polling day itself? And the morning of the 24th, it was this very bright pink sunrise. I remember walking back from the Vote Leave office across Westminster Bridge and feeling full of possibilities. And it was as though you'd been shut in a room for half a century. And now the door had been opened. And the room was comfortable enough. There was, it was habitable. There was food there, but you were constrained. You couldn't reach your full potential. And then, as the door opens, you see the sunlight streaming in. And you see the meadow beyond, and you see the swallows swooping. Now, it seems to me what we've done is we went through the door, and then we sat on the doorstep. We were incredibly slow to take advantage of the commercial and regulatory opportunities that presented themselves as a consequence of Brexit. And you've touched on the reasons why, Camilla, right? Yes, there was the massive distraction of the pandemic. That was nobody's fault. Yes, we were being slow-walked by a highly ideological cadre within the civil service that were determined to ensure that we could go back in and therefore to prevent any significant divergence. I won't bore you with it now, but I could give you chapter and verse on ministers instructing their officials to do certain things, and those things not happening. The officials never say no, right? It's yes, minister. Somebody just goes, oh, yeah, leave that with me, minister, and it doesn't happen, right? On minor things, but also on major ones, on tariffs, on deregulation. But also there has been, I think, a general failure of ambition. And I mean, it is extraordinary, for example, that the very first use of our financial freedoms after Brexit, being outside MiFID and the banking system, was to increase the amount of reserves that banks had to hold as statute. We were imposing on ourselves a more regulated and less competitive system than we'd had in the EU. And of course, the supreme example of where we've done that is energy policy. Outside the EU, we could have got out of some of these boondoggles and pursued cheaper energy. In fact, we've gone in the opposite direction. So for a whole bunch of reasons, the picture of that sunlit meadow has not been realized.
Okay.
We paid a high price in the talks for the freedom to diverge, and then, bewilderingly, we have not used that freedom.
Okay, so Liam, on an economic front, Catherine's identified the doppelganger effect of maintaining that because of Brexit, we've dropped 4% in GDP. Is there an alternative narrative that would suggest that had we actually maximised the opportunities more, not necessarily going all the way to becoming Singapore-on-Thames, but close to it, we'd actually be in a better economic position now? Or has Labour wrought so much devastation that it doesn't make much difference?
It's very, very complicated. Look, whenever you try and impose some kind of reality on TV debates, we're all veterans of TV debates on this panel, and you get 25 seconds to answer, and you're constantly interrupted by whoever's comparing, whereas the pro-Remain people are given a free rein and the crowd's stacked against you, and you get booed and hissed at. That's literally happened to me half a dozen times on any questions and question time. There's a general assumption, even among people who voted to leave, I accept that there have been economic downsides, but the freedom aspects of it outweigh the economic downsides. I don't actually accept that there's been net economic downsides at all. And the book that I wrote with Dr. Gerard Lyons, which I think stands up pretty well, which came out in 2017, outlines a very positive vision of the freedoms that we could express and benefit from under Brexit. And as Dan has rightly said, a combination of a lack of political ambition and courage, but also administrative torpor and indeed sabotage by senior mandarins looking for superannuated tax-free jobs in Brussels to round off their careers. Let's be completely clear about what's happening here. Plus a kind of middle-class neurosis that it's bad to leave the European Union has meant that governments, particularly, the Conservative government itself, successive Conservative governments, have almost been ashamed of the fact that we voted to leave. Of course there have been some economic downsides, but there have been many, many economic upsides, and the upsides could be far more if we were more ambitious, it seems to me. And as Dan said, there are some areas where not only have we not made use of our Brexit freedoms, we've made things even more difficult for ourselves. Talk to car manufacturers who are now starting to pipe up about the so-called ZEV mandates, zero emission vehicle mandates. Our rules on when there is literally a ban coming in that you can't, it's illegal to sell new petrol and diesel cars. And our ban's coming in 2030, believe it or not. Car manufacturers are now rationing the sale of petrol and diesel cars because for every petrol and diesel car they sell over a certain percentage of their total car sales that aren't EVs, they get fined £15,000 per car. That's completely prohibitive. Our ban's coming in 2030, the EU's ban is 2035, and guess what? Common sense prevailed, and the powerful French and German and Italian car manufacturers have told Brussels to get stuffed, and that 2035 ban's probably going to be 2040 fudged in that typical EU way. So it's almost as if we've got a neurosis, even in the Conservative Party, about implementing Brexit. And now, of course, what's happening is Labour are flirting with the idea of Brexit. I mean, the lack of political strategy is mind-boggling. You know, a party that originated from the Brexit Party storms the local elections, and as the very, very courageous, I think, Red Wall Labour MP Jonathan Hinder said, and our response is to get closer to the EU. You literally couldn't make it up. So I think we have to be more courageous, and people who are members of the Conservative Party have to accept that their own party, I mean, there has been some good progress. I think Liz Truss, whisper it, deserves some credit for signing some trade deals. Kemi Badenoch deserves some credit for signing some trade deals. There have been some areas of progress, but not nearly enough. And of course, the grotesque outcome that a lot of people did vote for Brexit because they didn't like Schengen and they didn't like untrammeled borders. For us as a government, people in public life, to then hit those people with 1 million plus net immigration was insane.
And we get on to Schengen in just a minute, because actually we've witnessed a degree of fragmentation of the EU since we left, the Netherlands now, Hungary, running away from Schengen at great speed. But Catherine, to those who suggest that it has been a disaster, quote Wes Streeting, and those who say that trade barriers have put up and the so-called barrier down the Irish Sea, I mean, is this all just smoke and mirrors, or is there something in that rhetoric? Because you were nodding when Liam said, I don't think it's had much economic impact at all.
Yeah, I was nodding, and I do think that what has happened is we've changed who pays. A lot of people thought trading with the EU was free because they didn't pay, because they didn't equate the fact that the government was paying money to the EU as the reason why they could trade with the EU without filling in all the paperwork they have to fill in. And that is now that those costs are back where they belong, on the person making the profits from exporting to the EU, they're up in arms about it. Yet the same companies will happily export to the US, which is our biggest market, or they'll export to China, which is also a big buyer of our goods, surprisingly, or Australia or New Zealand, and they pay their own costs when they do that, and they fill in their own forms, and they have no trouble doing that. But when they have to fill in a form to trade with Europe, they're apoplectic, and they think that somehow this is now costing them money. And I have heard quite well-respected economists say, oh no, of course there have been costs with Brexit. And you're going, no, the EU was never free. And as Steve rightly pointed out, now it's even less free than it was before. It's double the money. And we've now got a ridiculous situation where they still pay their farmers, they still subsidise their farmers, and they're now subsidising their farmers even more to get their farmers to accept the Mercosur deal that the EU spent 25 years negotiating, and the farmers are up in arms about it, so now they're going to give them even bigger payments, so they're going to be even more subsidised. And we're about to open up our borders to them. And yes, there have been border control, but our border control have been one area that's really worked. I've just come from the House of Lords where I was giving evidence on this in a House of Lords session. And the people before me were from the border side. and they were talking about this, and it's sort of like, and the NFU were there, and they were also going, as Steve mentioned, yes, let's join, but not our bet, if you don't mind, not our bet either. Because in the last year, there's been massive outbreaks in the EU of foot and mouth disease and African swine fever. And DEFRA has even published this report, which I luckily managed to print out and take a copy with me to the EU. Because right now, our border force has caught something like 1,000 cases of diseased pork trying to get into the UK, and they have also caught foot and mouth disease trying to get into the UK. And without that border force, that wouldn't have happened. And when we go into this crazy reset, that won't happen anymore either. So our own farmers will discover, not only are they now planting crops that they'll have to put in the bin because of the change in the MRL, but they'll also discover that very quickly our pig farms will be susceptible to African swine fever, and our pig farmers are not subsidised like the EU, and that isn't part of the reset, so the subsidies aren't coming back. So our whole agricultural industry is going to be wiped out, which will be great because they can all be turned into solar farms,
Yes.
which is obviously where people want this to go.
Benefiting massively China.
Yes.
Funnily enough, Barry Gardner once said to me on the way back from Question Time that if Brexit happened, we wouldn't see a sheep in the fields of England again. I'm not sure that's worked out to be true. Scaremongering, Project Fear at its highest. Dan, we talked earlier about the fragmentation of Europe, this idea of realigning with a bloc that is increasingly unhappy with itself, may soon witness the election of Le Pen, the return of the AfD, Germany now wanting to move away from European-wide open border policy for very obvious reasons. Maybe our timing was just out.
It's funny, isn't it, how little interest there is from rejoiners in what is happening in the EU. And you realise that rejoin is a kind of Jacobitism. It isn't a practical plan to rejoin. It's a badge. It's a way of saying this is, that drooling half-wit Steve Bray outside, do you think he's following what is happening in European Parliament elections? And of course not. This is all just about, I'm a nice person, I still hate the people who voted leave. And that, I'm afraid, has continued to disfigure our politics to a surprising degree, that you'll have MPs and peers who would normally be in favour of ambitious trade deal with Australia, say, or deregulate, but they don't like the idea of lining up with Brexiteers, and so they find themselves arguing the opposite. But I just want to come back to what Liam was saying about our reluctance to seize the economic and regulatory opportunities. Let's take cookies. Everyone likes cookies, but I don't mean the ones you eat. I mean the ones that you, if you're a typical person, 5 times a day, scroll down and negotiate around, right? I remember Guido Fawkes, immediately after the vote, saying, this is my test of whether Brexit has happened. The data protection rules that require us to waste all that time online are EU rules. Now that we are outside the EU, we don't need to do it. So how long until we scrap the rules? And there was some debate about it, and of course, Sir Humphrey prevailed, and it was all thought to be much too difficult, and some of our companies were using EU servers, and so we dropped the idea. And you know what? I was talking to an MEP friend today about something else, and he said, oh, we're getting rid of that now. So yet again, as with the cars, we're going to end up not just having failed to take advantage of the regulatory opportunity, but having failed more spectacularly than the EU has done, right,
yeah.
to get out of their own rules. And the paradox, Camilla, is this. In the small number of areas where we have pressed home our advantage, the success has been unarguable. One of the problems we had, I was listening to Gullifoyle before with all the Brexit advantages, one of the problems we have is a lot of those advantages are negative in the sense of we didn't have to do a bad thing that we would have had to do if we'd been met, right? So we are not part of the COVID recovery fund boondoggle, for example, right? Difficult to sell that to voters. A bad thing might have happened, take it from someone who fought elections for 25 years. It's never an easy sell. But where we have actively diverged, AI being a supreme example, right? You can get Apple Intelligence on the phone here, you can't get it in Europe. it's been an obvious success. Gene editing, biotech. Where we've done it, it has worked.
Vaccines.
And yet, vaccines, right, and the delivery of the vaccines, and yet an absolute refusal to infer from that, to extrapolate from it, and to have confidence in our capacity. Actually, your talk of vaccines makes me make one quasi-related point, Camilla, which is I think an awful lot of this conversation is happening in the shadow of our extraordinary national reluctance to admit the cost of the pandemic. We paid ourselves to stay home for the better part of 2 years, and we are now surprised that there is a bill attached. We borrowed from our future selves for the better part of 2 years. And then, when the bills come due in higher prices, in higher taxes, in higher debt, we blame the politicians. No, this was going to happen. It was obviously going to happen from March 2020. And the idea that there are people saying, we're poorer because of Brexit, when we have this massive, crater, smoking hole where our economy used to be because of what we did, the decisions we made in 2020, I just think is bad faith, is a dishonest way of thinking.
Okay, let's try and end on a positive note with solutions. Now, if you were handed the keys to Downing Street tomorrow, and let's be honest, you only have to run as a candidate in Makerfield to Makerfield that happen, and you could enact one radical regulatory or trade policy change that is only possible because we left the EU in a bid to maximise growth, what would it be? My personal favourite, a little bit in line with the cookies, I just want to unscrew a plastic bottle and have the lid come off completely. Liam.
It kind of scratches your cheek, doesn't it? It's really, I know, it's really, really annoying. One thing we can do, people in this room, is this isn't a cop-out, is to counter the constant negativity. The EU is the slowest growing continent in the world, with the exception of Antarctica. Before, we were in the single market from 1993 to 2019, growth averaged 2.1%. During the 30 years before that, growth averaged 2.7% a year. Of course, there are various reasons why that happened, but it's simplified to the point of being simplistic to say that life was better in the EU because the single market sounds like a nice thing. So we do have to constantly counter the negativity. I want to see us seriously deregulate this economy. I want to see us lowering rates of VAT on certain goods where the EU makes that impossible. I want to see us moving towards lower corporation tax. Above all, I want to see us sign a lot more trade deals with other countries, the freedom that the EU gives us, and to raise our sights beyond the European Union, because it is a declining part of the world, because their model isn't working. It's statist, it's high tax, it's high debt. We seem to have become more like the EU since we left the EU. Yeah. And I think that is an indication of the extent to which a lot of our political elite, particularly the Mandarin class, but a lot of the media class as well, they're ashamed of the fact that we left the European Union. So it comes to those of us, and we take a lot of social opprobrium for it, don't we? We have to keep banging this drum. There are many different reasons why being outside the EU is a good thing when it comes to freedom, when it comes to sovereignty and so on. But we've got to make use in particular of these economic freedoms. What are we doing in the City of London? Why are there so few companies on AIM these days? There are 700 companies on AIM. 10 years ago, there were almost 2,000, as if we don't need more funding for our small businesses. We are a country that has lived and breathed innovation, world-beating innovation, legislative, scientific innovation. We have to rediscover that confidence, and so we have to keep pushing back against the still very heavy cultural sense that those of us who did vote to leave the European Union did so for reasons that were anything but honest and open and democratic. So we've got to stand up and be proud.
Amen to that. Catherine.
Well, you guys got the two best ones, but I am going to go for getting rid of the windfall tax, otherwise known as the energy profits levy, And all of the net zero rubbish, I'm not allowed to swear apparently.
You can say that.
Because it's, you have to play to your strengths. And the UK is not the world's biggest country. We don't have untold resources, but we do have huge quantities of oil, gas and coal. And we are not saving the planet by keeping our own oil, gas and coal in the ground or underneath the North Sea and then importing oil, gas and coal from places as far away as Australia and Madagascar and the US and even Norway, who's getting it out of the same sea we would be getting it out of. So I think that is where we've gone horribly wrong.
It's the definition of madness.
And I do think that that is why, well, one of the problems we did have with, we had Brexiteers who were also completely in love with the green crap is the word, I think, yes. The green crap, that's the word I was looking for. And so they did undermine themselves because we had the ability, and now we need to do what Thatcher did and get that energy going, because it will help our balance of payments, it will raise taxes, increase employment. There is no downside for us, and it won't even increase the carbon dioxide we use. We just got to start counting imports as equal to production.
Sure.
And, you know, it's the same.
Dan.
Number one, stop the powers that used to be exercised by officials in Brussels being transferred just to equivalent officials here. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no point in taking power back from Brussels if we just leave it festering in regulatory bodies which are as safetyist, as risk-averse, and as uninterested in growth and competitiveness as any European commissioner. So we should take power back and then push it downwards and outwards to local authorities, or better yet, to individual citizens. Number two, stop allowing our entire trade policy to be dictated by the Euro-fanatical leadership of the National Farmers Union. It is extraordinary that we couldn't get a trade deal with Canada because of concerns about beef, which are a tiny sector of a tiny sector in this country. Right? And by the way, we're nowhere near close enough to supplying our own market in beef. Right? So the argument is about allowing beef imports from outside the EU to displace those from Ireland and France. It is extraordinary that we give people who want the status quo a veto over trade. And if we can't do a trade deal with Canada, what hope of a trade deal with Mercosur or the big opportunities coming up? Number three, it's the anti-social chapter agenda, right? We should be deregulating our employment market. We're doing the opposite now. One of the reasons that unemployment is going up is we are making it very expensive to hire people and very risky to hire people because it's very difficult to get rid of them if they don't work out as employees. It is extraordinary that we've had a nearly 2/3 increase in the value of the minimum wage since lockdown, and that nobody is prepared to point out the connection between that fact and rising unemployment. Politicians are paralyzed, politicians in all parties, paralyzed by the fear of being asked, how would you like to live on £12.72 an hour? Well, it's an irrelevant question, right? I mean, who cares whether they would like to? The question is this negatively impacting our economy before we even get to the national insurance and all the rest of it? So we could be massively strengthening our competitiveness. And then fourth and finally, the same idea that we just heard from Catherine. We are able to pace our approach to decarbonisation in a way that does not destroy our economic viability. We are really exposed in this country, I think maybe uniquely exposed, to the changes which will come as a result of the AI revolution. We're a very services-based economy. A lot of the jobs we do here, in legal services, in financial services, in call centres, are exactly the ones that are going to be made obsolete by the algorithms. What are the people who are currently doing those jobs going to go on to do instead? Well, basically you go in one of two directions. Either you start making stuff, or you start using the AI to do new things, right? What do those two things have in common, manufacturing and AI? What do they have in common? They are very energy thirsty.
Yes.
And we have lumbered ourselves with the most expensive industrial energy costs in the developed world. And as long as that's the case, we are condemning ourselves to penury. There's no point in blaming the EU about this. We are choosing to be poor. So I'll finish, if I may, with a plea for people to mean what they say when they talk about growth, politicians and voters, right? Everyone says we've got to grow, growth is our priority. But then come all the qualifiers. They don't really want growth if it means getting rid of the triple lock. They don't really want growth if it means firing a lot of state employees. They don't really want growth if it means building more houses near them. They don't really want growth if it means admitting more high-skilled immigrants. They don't really want growth if it means abandoning parts of the net zero agenda. Well, in that case, you don't really want growth. Right? But be honest about this. Poverty is a choice that we are inflicting on ourselves. Outside the EU, we have the capacity to do something about that. Let's seize it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.